Yeah, there, that's what I have to do. I got it. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm so excited that you're both here. Welcome, Scott Kurashige. Welcome, Jerry Goldberg. You both have done really great work for Detroit. And because we don't have, so many friends in the world, I'm glad that you are speaking up for Detroiters, especially when, I'm disheartened to see news reporters talking to Detroiters and Detroiters saying that they don't feel heard or represented. So thank you for trying to intervene in that story. I want to introduce Scott Kurashige, the author of The 50-Year Rebellion, a book that talks about exactly what the subtitle is, how the U.S. political crisis began in Detroit. So Professor Kurashige, you say the U.S. political crisis began about 50 years in Detroit. So some people don't feel that we have a crisis. I'm hoping that you can help define what the crisis is and what it is about the city that helps us understand it.
Thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining us. So I want to try to put this into context, right? Because obviously we're talking a lot about conflict right now with an election coming up and, jockeying for power, Republicans and Democrats, Trump and Biden. And obviously there's been a lot of tension and conflict in Detroit, but the bigger picture is there's a systemic crisis, right? It predates Trump. It's bigger than Detroit. There's a systemic crisis that's economic and political and really cultural in nature too. Sorry, I just disappeared from my own screen. And that crisis really is a crisis of the system of capitalism. There was a liberal model of capitalism through the middle of the 20th century. Basically, capitalism through the New Deal saved itself from the threats from communism on the left and fascism on the right. And we ended up with a model that was sort of capitalism with reform, that admitted there was inequalities, but started to create greater standards for working people, for oppressed people, people of color, women. And the idea that liberalism offered was, well, the system may not be perfect, but gradually over time, we can make it better. We can include more people. We can increase their standard of living, give them more rights, give them, take care of the poor. And what we really saw in the 60s rebellions was that system was not able to deliver, and it really was never even set up to deliver. The promise of reform was always simply to delay the, kick the can down the road, right? And make people think that things will get better someday. We clearly are in a political state today where, the ruling party right now in office has no even pretense that it's going to fix things down there, and then it's going to shift things more to the right down the road. So what we've had since I would say the last 50 years is this crisis where the system that, again, certainly not everyone bought into, but legitimized itself to where it was relatively stable for a long period of time, has been in crisis. And there's been intense competition over what comes next, right? There's some people that still have a stake in the old order, but as we can see, there's much more range of opinion politically out there now. And that includes, of course, more options for people on the left and these extreme, dangerous, violent, factions, tendencies, movements on the far right. And this is not just a US phenomenon, right? It's a global phenomenon. It has to do with, again, the real structural contradictions built into capitalism. Capitalism is not set up to be a system to serve everybody. It's set up to make certain people profitable. It's set up to make property private for some, and for others to, have their labor exploited, or to have their bodies as well as their property dispossessed from them. So Detroit is at the center of this, not because, and this is the thing I really want to stress, there's so many ways in which the popular culture, the mainstream media dump on Detroit and say how bad things are. The reality is Detroit was at the center of this crisis, or the epicenter of this crisis, because it had such a strong, it really had a uniquely strong labor movement and a uniquely strong civil rights and Black power movement, really. So the real question is, not why are things so bad in Detroit, right? There's a narrative that somebody says everything was great until, Black politicians replaced white mayors, and so now we need to go back to having a white mayor. Or, things were fine until Detroit became a majority Black city. Those are sort of the racist narratives that are out there. But really, the question is, why did Detroit become the center of this neoliberal right-wing assault on its political, power and representation, to the point where, again, ultimately you get a complete state takeover, right? It's because Detroit was really at the center of workers' power and Black power, and that was threatening to the existing order, right?
What's funny is that Detroit is unlike many cities. It's like Puerto Rico, right? And it's had a similar sort of emergency management and then very sort of strong arm tactics to redesign the economy in ways that perhaps were invisible for this period you're suggesting between the 60s and the 90s. All of a sudden, through emergency management, the city becomes something completely different. It seems unique.
Yeah. Well, it is in the sense that this particular form of bankruptcy on a municipal, scale was unprecedented, and the systematic way in which the governor and the emergency manager came in and took over Detroit obviously is on a bigger scale than what's happened in other cities. So obviously it's also happened in other cities in Detroit, particularly in cities with predominantly Black populations. But it's not separate from what's going on elsewhere, right? It's a more intense, aggravated manifestation of what's going on. I mean, literally now we have a president in office who's saying, people just voting is not a legitimate process, right? I mean, denouncing the possibility of any election outcome in which he doesn't win. I mean, this is what we see dictators, authoritarian rulers all over the place doing. And it's simply a way of saying, I want to get my way. I want to impose my power on people, whether that's done democratically or not, right? So the emergency management law, and remember the whole state of Michigan voted to overturn that law. And then it was reinstated by the lame duck, GOP controlled legislature and signed by the governor. So these are policies and things being implemented, laying off workers, gutting union power, gutting pensions. These things were all happening. These were all extremely unpopular things that were being imposed, right? And so if you had subjected them to democratic majority decision-making, they most likely wouldn't have happened, right? Similarly right now, I mean, we have ways in which, the Senate can pass things and do things without representing a majority of the country. You can win the presidency, right? With electoral votes, but without winning actually a majority of the people's vote. And so it's a response to the crisis. It's what many would call a counter-revolutionary response to the crisis, try to turn things backwards against the will of the majority. And so I think that's clearly something that's happened in Detroit that's taken on a very extreme turn because Detroit is majority Black, and then you have, these white business elites, corporate elites like Dan Gilbert come in and they can buy up, literally, it seems like almost every building in downtown, right, within a short period of time. Whereas at the same time, you have tens of thousands of working class Detroit, particularly African-American homeowners, losing their houses to foreclosure. Just today, there's been a whole new expose about the demolitions have happened so fast. I mean, so not only do you have money that was supposed to go to helping people stay in their houses being used to tear down people's houses so that the land can be bought up by speculators and developers. Now we're also seeing that was done in such a hasty, unsafe fashion that it exposed so many children and families, particularly in low-income Black neighborhoods, to lead poisoning, right? Because when you tear down a house, it's got all these contaminants and pollutants in it. And if you do it in such a short period of time in a concentrated way, then people get severely exposed to that. So that was just in the news in the last 24 hours I saw. So I think, you know, in many ways, again, what's happening in Detroit, it takes on an extreme form because racism, because classism is used to impose these anti-democratic measures and disenfranchise people. But then these extremes set a new standard. They sort of move the bar for everybody across the country. And I think, you know, as been seen, you talked about Puerto Rico. I mean, as I wrote in the last chapter of my book, all of these folks that literally worked on the Detroit bankruptcy and took credit for orchestrating these new, basically taking a corporate bankruptcy model and applying it to a city in an unprecedented way, then said, we've created a model we can take all over the world. And they literally went straight to Puerto Rico and were working as consultants for basically the neoliberal corporate, you know, restructuring measures they were imposing upon Puerto Rico through PROMESA and other things like that. I mean, literally some of the exact people, I think Andy Dillon was one of those that started working for these companies.
Well, you know, it's funny because as a Puerto Rican, right, and as also a New Yorker, I've seen a lot of different disasters, lived through a lot of different disasters, Katrina, you know, 9/11. And it strikes me that, you know, the planet right now is living through a disaster. And something that I've learned from having lived through several disasters is as you are going through it, you really don't understand what's happening, right? There's this almost like this sort of cognitive dissonance where this can't be happening because this just doesn't make sense. My brain can't process it. And that's what your book feels a lot like. You start with bank foreclosures, right? And the predatory loans. And then you remind us of the auto bailouts. And then you hit us with the emergency management, first of schools, it starts in the 90s, and then of the city. And then you talk about the water liens that lead to foreclosures. You talk about tax foreclosures. So it just feels like a lot of disasters that happen in a very short amount of time, in 5 years, right? And it's very hard, I think, still, you know, working in Detroit through that entire period, even for myself and my students to make sense of it. I'm wondering if you can give us some, you know, high-level overview that helps us make sense of such a complicated, you know, couple of years that we went through there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when we're in a crisis, right, there's these different competing tendencies that affect human beings. One is that sense of to help each other, to survive, we have to stand together, right? That in a crisis, you know, the only way to survive, as Gracie Bogg said, is by taking care of each other, right? And on the other hand, there's this sort of bunker mentality or this gated community mentality, or, you know, there's that couple in St. Louis that pulled out their guns when they saw Black Lives Matter protesters in St. Louis. There's that sense of somehow it's, you know, that desire to fight and individualize your sense of survival, right? There's the people that, you know, when the pandemic first hit, started sewing masks for other people and donating things to doctors and nurses and first responders. And then there was others that went and hoarded all the supplies of hand sanitizer and, you know, toilet paper that they got. I think there's always those competing tendencies, and we're always trying to balance those to survive as a human society. But we have a system that's been in place that rewards the individualist, greediest tendencies. And so what we had in Detroit became the model of this. We had reforms, we had policies, we had laws, measures that were put in place to check those extreme impulses towards exploitation, greed, and individual wealth. I mean, it used to be, if you were a worker and your hand got cut off, you could be fired or sent home or had your pay docked, right? You know, because you lost fingers on an assembly line. You know, we had labor laws, we had labor movement, we had union standards, workplace standards, occupational safety standards, right? And since really the last 50 years, there's been a trend in the other direction to where not only are we losing those reforms, but we're losing those reforms in the name of strengthening the people who most want most want a sort of dog eat dog capitalist system where the rich prevail, and the others simply have to, whatever, beg, borrow, and steal just to survive, right? And so the Detroit bankruptcy and state takeover in many ways was an extreme acceleration of that trend, right? Detroit, because it still has some strong unions, because it still had some strong, voter base for these workers' rights and civil rights protections. The emergency management really was a way to sort of wipe away all those rights, take away those, disenfranchise those voters, and disempower those workers and their unions, so that this single figure, corporate bankruptcy attorney Kevin Orr, doing the work of corporations and Republicans in Lansing, could simply come in and write the rules however he wanted, right? And so we saw, right, a really dramatic shift happen in Detroit in a very short period of time. But those are sort of longer term trends and then a really short term acceleration of them. And again, so it's not what happened was separate from what happened previously, and it's not separate from the trends happening throughout the country. Right? As we can see, voter suppression is a trend throughout the whole country. So, saying that your city council and mayor have no power anymore was an extreme version of saying your votes don't matter. But it's not separate from what's happening in Georgia or Texas, where I live right now, where governors tried to shut down ballot drop-off boxes and so on.
You do make an issue of talking about all of the different fees that the contractors made during the emergency management, during the bankruptcy. I think one of the numbers I heard was 200 million in all of those fees, and the bankruptcy was about 700 million. So it represents a big chunk of, in a already tough situation. How do we make sense of those fees that continue to, as you point out, go with PROMESA to Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like with these demolitions. There's a proposal right now for another $250 million in demolition money. They've already spent over, something like quarter billion from the sort of the TARP stimulus bailout funds from when Obama was president, that they redirected again towards demolition instead of helping people have funds to basically avoid foreclosure, right? To help pay off their loans, their mortgages. I mean, part of it is there's people just simply self-interested in invested in making this money, right? I mean, so you've got all these people out there competing for these monies. Most of them are not even Detroit-based businesses. Most of them are not Black-owned businesses. So there's a whole, business class of folks out there that simply want that money, whether they're the corporate attorneys, whether they're the demolition companies, whether they're companies like, is it Homrich that was there to shut off, that got paid per house, to shut off as many water lines as possible in people's houses. So yeah, I mean, that's a sad part of it, is that, yeah, when the money's out there, instead of this government funding being used directly to help people and serve people, it's being used to advance this other agenda that ends up making people lose water, lose housing, and there was a quote from John Gallagher, who writes for the Free Press, on one level he's a very smart architectural historian and critic. He's a generally liberal-minded person, who believes in equity. But the way he framed the choices for this city, I think very much encouraged this kind of thinking, where he said, the problem with the City Council of Detroit is they had a social worker mentality. And Mary Mann Mahaffey, a Wayne State alum and former faculty member, was really one of my friends. She was very much a liberal, progressive person who, yes, believed that when the city received funds, it should go to the people most in need, right? And what Gallagher said, and again, this is his own words, so I'm not even characterizing them. He said, the problem with that social worker mentality is you never get this big bang for your buck. You can't sort of, you can't, if you're simply spreading the money around, you can't revitalize the whole downtown or create a splash where you get the big bang for your buck. But in some ways, that was the point, right? Instead of having the money go in big chunks to Dan Gilbert or other investors, or even these kind of liberal-minded planning people, it was going directly to the people most in need, right? And that's what's really been lost, right? Now, how many libraries have been shut down? How many rec centers have been shut down? How many schools have been shut down? And so what you have is an even greater gap between the privileged, right, and the not privileged in the city. And so much of that tracks onto racial disparities that Detroit has really become a symbol of this. And then, of course, when you have those disparities, it links to disparities in policing and imprisonment and so on, and everything becomes linked in a really vicious cycle.
Right. I think it's interesting how the state, and I'm interested in thinking more about how even the federal government helps that process of dispossession. It's not something that just happens. It happens because of the kinds of force that you see under emergency management. But at this point, I want to bring Jerry Goldberg, who's with Moratorium NOW, to come in on the conversation, because he's been working a lot with, evictions, foreclosures, and utility shutoffs. So basically everything we're talking about. And I wonder, Jerry, what take you have on the conversation thus far?
Well, I agree with much of it. My own history is a 50-year history in Detroit. I moved to Detroit in 1970. I was part of SDS in Ann Arbor. Became a revolutionary when I was in college. And I moved to Detroit with a lot of fellow revolutionaries, because we understood that the revolution wasn't going to come through the students, it was going to come through the working class. And when I moved to Detroit, it was in 1970. And as Scott said, in 1970, Detroit was a heyday. Detroit was a center, really, of the Black liberation struggle, in many ways of the revolutionary struggle. I became a revolutionary because at that time, worldwide, oppressed people that were fighting US imperialism, by and large, were Marxists and socialists all over the world. The Vietnamese were defeating the US, led by the Vietnamese Communist Party. I went to Cuba in 1970 and spent 2.5 months in Cuba, and it was really the heyday of Cuba. Cuba was in the midst of its 10 billion ton high-cut cane with revolutionaries from all over the world, and it was a tremendous experience. And all over the world, really, you had lived in Africa, in Southern Africa, in Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola. Liberation movements were all led by Marxists. So there was a revolutionary current worldwide that began finding its way, certainly into layers of the Black struggle, especially in the Black Panther Party and in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Detroit was a particular center of that movement because it was the place where the Black liberation struggle merged with the worker struggle, primarily because there were so many Black workers in the auto plants. And the League of Revolutionary Black Workers became an expression of that, bringing revolutionary Marxist politics into the working class struggle. And that was a tremendous fear to the powers that be, because it meant that where in many cities, Black workers were in a more dispossessed class. In Detroit, they were in the center of production and had the power to shut down production. And I actually worked, when I first moved into Detroit, I worked in a plant that was mostly white out in Wayne, Michigan truck plant out in Wayne. But it was interesting, and it was when I hired in, the racism used to kill my ears. It was so terrible. But within 2 years, we formed a caucus in that plant and elected 5 Black committeemen out of 7 in a plant that was only about 10% Black. And the reason was the white workers were saying that the Black workers in the city were fighting back, and the white workers were also exploited. And when we pulled together a multinational caucus, we were able to, these same white workers who maybe came from very racist backgrounds, they saw that their material interest to deal with their own exploitation was in linking up with that struggle on some level. Doesn't mean they suddenly weren't racist and they went through a moral transformation overnight, but it showed the power of the struggle. And Detroit represented that, and it was a great city. I mean, there was no, one summer in '74, there was two Black workers were fired by a racist supervisor. 5,000 workers surrounded the plant at Jefferson Assembly. There was a plant takeover at Mack Avenue, Mack Stamping. week after week there were struggles, and of course, and Mayor Young was really elected based on that struggle. I mean, Mayor Young, there was a big struggle when Stress came in. The Stress was a killer police squad that was brought into Detroit. There was basically a squad to kill Black people. It murdered 15 unarmed Black people in a year, and also was used and directed against political activists as well. We experienced that firsthand. And there was a big movement against Stress. Thousands of people, all the groups came together. And some young Black workers actually picked up the gun against them and had a shootout when Stress was defending, the cops were defending a dope house and became heroes. And Mayor Young had enough sophistication. He himself was not a revolutionary by any means, but he came out of the communist movement and had enough sophistication to kind of use that movement to get elected mayor. And his election was a significant election because it was the first time that a Black mayor in a major Black city had been elected. And as Scott said, the city council at that time in Detroit kind of had the characteristic more of what you saw in Europe, where you had more what they call social democratic regimes that had a little, that was still for the capitalist system, felt the need for reform. And really our leadership came out of this, and all of them came out of the struggle. We had Marxist city council people, Ken Cockrell, we had a Marxist judge. It was a different city than almost any city. And what happened was, in my experience, is in the late 70s, the auto companies, when Chrysler went bankrupt in 1979, it signaled the beginning of major restructuring of auto and the elimination of tens of thousands of jobs through automation, as well as through much more intense globalization and movement of jobs overseas, which was based in Detroit, was 70% African American, I believe, at that time, decided to do that, decided to do its restructuring. They saw that as an opportunity to destroy the base of the Black workers in the city of Detroit. So what Chrysler did is they conducted their restructuring by shutting all their plants in Detroit except for one, and keeping all their plants in the suburbs open. And so, it carried out the restructuring on the backs of the Black workers of Detroit, and in many ways destroyed the base, the power base of the Black workers in Detroit, which in many ways would distinguish Detroit from other cities in its role in the Black liberation struggle. And there was a fight against it. There was a lot of resistance to it. There was Angel Davis came in. It was a big resistance to it. But the UAW leadership, in my opinion, they viewed it as the lesser of two evils. They had no program to challenge the restructuring, and they also feared the strength of the militant Black workers as becoming an alternative power base to the leadership that existed then. So they kind of let that restructuring go on, and they refused to challenge the shutdown, the vicious restructuring in Detroit. And it had a big impact. It changed the character of Detroit at that time from a city where Black workers and Black youth could get a job in an auto plant, make a decent living, albeit in a very exploitative job. Those jobs were taken away. And Detroit went from a center where Black people made a relatively decent living relative to the rest of the US to a city of poverty. And at the same time, Ronald Reagan got elected, and Ronald Reagan's program was the complete destruction of social programs on behalf of tax breaks to the rich and the buildup of the military. And Reagan particularly hated Mayor Young, who always called him, I forgot the phrase he had, prune face. And so all the federal funds that came into Detroit that could be used to alleviate the poverty were completely eliminated. And there was literally an economic boycott of Detroit where no jobs were brought into Detroit during the period until 1990. It was like, it wasn't a whole lot different to what the ruling class did to Iraq, did to Syria, any country that resists, did to Libya, that resists imperialism is subject to that kind of destructive character of, and that's what happened to Detroit.
I want to pick up on something you're saying that I think is really interesting. It's funny, maybe a coincidence, but Professor Kurashige, you speak about the anti-Detroit sentiment among suburban whites. And I'm sure you know that this summer, President Trump had tweeted about the suburban lifestyle dream. And it's interesting because you're talking about the American dream, and what is this suburban lifestyle dream, and what is it that about the suburbs that's pitted against the urban? I mean, that the fact that it has national resonance says something.
Who do you want to answer that?
You.
Oh, okay.
Because you talked about the
Yeah.
suburban area around Detroit.
I mean, again, this is something that's happened really nationwide, but it's been particularly an acute problem in Detroit. You know, Thomas Segura, the historian, has written a book about this. It's gotten a lot of attention, justifiably. The gap between the city and the suburbs is a really important one. We certainly know it as a racial gap divide, though even that's changing because a lot of these suburbs that were originally all white, you know, like Clinton Township, you know, Oak Park, Southfield, East Point, which of course used to be East Detroit until when it was all white, they decided they wanted to change their name. Those places all have significantly black populations now. Warren, for instance, particularly Southern Warren. So it's not a clear racial divide as it used to be. I mean, the all white suburbs are now even further out there, whatever, 32 Mile or something out there. But clearly, historically, it's been a racial divide. And politicians have really found a way to exploit that, right, that racial divide by creating these kind of culture wars. I mean, but what Trump is doing now, saying that, you know, Cory Booker is going to somehow create policies to destroy the suburbs by bringing in, you know, low-income housing. This is an old narrative. It just sounds so crude to hear Trump say it because politicians had learned to refine their language and use more of those so-called dog whistle appeals that weren't so overtly inflammatory and racist, right? But really what it is, it's about the suburb becomes a model for privatization and for an individual way of thinking against that collective model that said, look, if capitalism has these inequalities, the way to give it more of a human face is to create more collective rights through unions, through civil rights laws, right? Through public housing. So instead of public housing, which gets overturned during the McCarthy era, federal subsidies go into individuals buying homes in the suburbs. Individuals. People couldn't afford mortgages for the most part until after World War II through the GI Bill and through the FHA, subsidizing it, making it so you could give a down payment of 10 or 20% instead of 50%, and then you can pay off your loan in 30 years rather than 10. So instead of like today, you know, if you had a 10-year loan and you had to put 50% down, you'd have to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars up front and then like a $5,000 payment each month. Nobody could afford, people can't afford housing as it is right now, but the government made it much more affordable. But so much of that money went into new suburban housing in these predominantly or all white neighborhoods, instead of public housing, which could have supported particularly poor people, you know, which did previously, right? And then now you see, you look around Detroit, all those public housing projects like Brewster, Jeffries, they've all either been torn down or converted into private housing, right? The other way in which that collective sense of collective good or public good gets turned into individualized benefit is through transportation, right? Instead of having public transportation, increasingly the suburbs subsidize people who drive cars, you know, the road, the payments for roads and bridges subsidize, you know, the trucking industry, and they subsidize individuals, while at the same time, it's getting harder and harder for people to, you know, have decent public transportation. There are still cities that have really solid public transportation compared to Detroit, but even places like New York are experiencing crisis. And obviously Detroit has nothing compared to the public transportation options that people have in a city like New York or Paris or London, for that matter, if you want to go further. And so, you know, you have that combination of an individualized mentality with this kind of gated community mentality that Detroit is dangerous, you know, that culture war sense of that Trump is talking about, right? That there's dangerous gangs and thugs and criminals that are about to, you know, invade your suburb unless you vote for these law and order candidates. Another example, L. Brooks Patterson, who passed away recently, he ruled Oakland County. He ruled the suburbs really for the wealthiest suburbs for 25 years. He started as an anti-busing lawyer, saying to suburban white people, you got to stop this busing, or basically black people from Detroit are going to are going to be basically taking over your kids' schools, right?
Right.
That mentality has been, that really fueled the suburbs for 25 years, a whole generation, really 50 years of structural development, 25 years of this intense politicization from Nixon up through Reagan and Bush. And it's really only now that you know, there's even a reverse trend, people moving back towards the cities and the suburbs themselves becoming more diverse, that perhaps Trump's appeal will not work in the same way that it has previously.
Right. But I would, if I could add to that, there's no question. I mean, there are two other factors I think that contribute to the character of Detroit. I mean, when I came into Detroit, you already had a big move to the suburbs after the rebellion and a lot of white flight from this, and that was characteristic. I grew up in south side of Chicago, and the same thing happened in my neighborhood in Chicago. I grew up in the city in Chicago, and most of the, in actually what it was kind of what they would call a middle class neighborhood, and most of the whites in my neighborhood left for the suburbs within about a 2 or 3 year period, emptied out that neighborhood in the 2 or 3. So that was a characteristic that was kind of a reaction to the rebellions and the racism that was whipped up and blockbusting and all that. But Detroit, even after that began and that process was going on in Detroit, Detroit was not a poor city because the black workers were making a decent living. And that's really important to remember. Detroit was a city where black workers were doing pretty well. It was not a poor city. What turned into a poor city, a center of poverty, was first of all, the conscious destruction of its industrial base, primarily by Chrysler, but then GM did the same thing in the late 80s, and it was done to destroy the power that black workers had in production. And that's very important. So when I was coming to Detroit, it was mostly a black city, but it was a city where, you know, black youth were making a living. You know, the unions were strong. It was a great city, and it turned into a poor city. The same people that were making a decent suddenly were thrust with no jobs, and no jobs were brought into the city, and that was a conscious decimation of the city by the major corporations, and especially by the auto companies, and especially by Chrysler and then General Motors. The second thing that happened was that after Detroit somewhat stabilized on a poorer level, by the year 2000, things were getting a little more stable in Detroit. The banks then came in, and the subprime mortgage crisis began in the early 2000s. And the subprime mortgage crisis was brought on by every major bank, because they were looking for a way to make big they kind of maxed out credit cards. They were looking for another way to make big income. And the subprime mortgage crisis, where by selling mortgages that people could no longer not pay, became a source of profit, a big profit, and was carried out in a racist fashion. And that's been established. There have been many studies that have shown where black families and white families had the same income, same credit base. The black families were placed in subprime loans and the whites weren't. Where Detroit still had the highest black homeownership in the country as of the early 2000s. And honestly, our neighborhoods look nothing like they did now. Even with all the industrial decimation, the neighborhoods were still intact. It was a place where people were living in homes. Black people were living in homes, and a white, a decent neighborhood. What happened? The banks came in the subprime mortgage crisis. It was a scheme they developed, and it's well documented. There's a great study called Wall Street and the Financial Crisis, which is always worth reading. It reads like The Godfather to me. And what they did is they trained brokers to go into neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, and they would go up to a senior citizen who had their home paid off, say, hey, don't you need a new roof? No problem. We'll sell you, we can refinance your home, and we'll sell you a loan. And for the first couple of years, the payment was an easy payment. By the third year, the loan adjusted upwards to where in many cases, and I saw this personally, the loans were more than the person was getting paid in their Social Security. And it was done deliberately, and it was done because what the banks did is they would securitize these loans and sell them as packages on Wall Street, as bonds on Wall Street, and the rate of profit on the subprime loans, and subprime means at least 3% higher than the Federal Reserve rate on loans. When they sold them on Wall Street, the rate of profit was 8 times greater than it was on the fixed rate mortgages. It was too good to resist. And every bank jumped into it. And Detroit became a center for that because we had the highest Black homeownership. So what happened from the years about 2005 to 2010, we had 65,000 mortgage foreclosures in the city of Detroit. We lost a quarter of our population from 2005 to 2010. And that was when the city had somewhat stabilized and the banks went in, and it was a conscious destruction of the city. And it was carried out, and honestly speaking, and the bailout, and the banks got bailed out to the tune of $700 billion, but that was just a piece of the bailout. The government nationalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were like quasi-government corporations that guaranteed all the loans for the banks. So what would happen is when someone got foreclosed on, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac would buy their loan, pay full value to the banks on that loan. The bank would then foreclose on the home, and then they would sell the home at a pittance for maybe, they would sell the banks got $100,000 on a loan on a home that maybe was worth $20,000. Then they would dump it on the market and sell it for $500 or $1,000. And that happened repeatedly. And I was in court on a lot of them. And unfortunately, most of that was done during the Obama administration. And that's a fact. And that's what happened to Detroit. The banks destroyed. What happened once the banks came in and destroyed the economic base of Detroit. So the next thing they did is they went to the city and they put the city in subprime loans, and they put the city in bond deals that were unpayable. And so the city had these bonds, and they'd go to the city, well, you need a bond. So they sold the city what they called pension obligation certificates. They sold these and to Kwame Kilpatrick, but he was treated as a hero when he bought them. They didn't call him corrupt then. They took him to Wall Street and feted him for them. But these loans were crooked, because what they did is they would tie the loans to what they called interest rate swaps. It's just what they did to Puerto Rico. So they would sell the city an adjustable rate bond, and they would tell the city, look, the same banks that sold the bond told the city, we'll sell you a swap. We'll pay, so you don't have to worry about the interest rates going up. You pay us a 5.5% fixed rate on the bond. We'll pay the adjustable rate. Whoever comes out ahead has to pay the difference. Because they were doing this at the same time they were selling these subprime loans, which caused interest rates to collapse to zero. So the city's paying the banks $50 million on top of the regular bonds, and that's what put the city into bankruptcy. And they did the same thing to the water department. That's what started the water. So the modern destruction of Detroit was a destruction brought on by finance capital in the banks, by their own greed, and somebody that who's a good bank, there wasn't a good bank. They were all rotten to the core. They all participated in it because the profit was too great. Gilbert was the one who originated. He was a loan originator. He gets rewarded now. He wrote most of those loans, and then he would sell them to the bigger banks because that's what he was. He was a loan originator. So this was a very conscious destruction, and it's just what they did to Puerto Rico. It's just what they did to Greece. It's just what the IMF did to Latin America in the 1980s. Fidel Castro called for canceling the debt to the banks in the early 80s. This is the pattern of what finance capital does, because it sees no boundary, no bound to make profit, and it just literally destroyed our city. And I was very involved with it. We called for a moratorium on foreclosures. Jennifer Granholm opposed it. Jennifer Granholm said when we raised it and we got a bill put in by Hanson Clark, her response was the banks wouldn't like it, and I have that on tape. And I view her as, and then she was the one who helped put in the emergency manager law. And the emergency manager was put in. When the emergency manager was put in, he was put in, if you read the law, what the law said is he had the power to get rid of all sorts of, rewrite all the contracts, but he could not touch the debt service to the banks. That was written into the law. The reason they went into bankruptcy was he couldn't also go after the bank with the pensions, which were constitutionally guaranteed. And as Scott said, he had to go into the bankruptcy to destroy the workers' pensions, which was really the destruction of the public unions.
I appreciate all your attention to the capital side of it, right? The banks and also the corporations that left Detroit. But I think that the point that I really want to make, drawing from Kurashige's book, is that this cannot happen without the support of the federal and the state government, right? It's the fact, for instance, you mentioned Patterson. He talks, you in your book reference that New Yorker article. He says, I love sprawl, right? So we hate Detroit sprawl, and Detroit politicians have messed up because of all of that sprawl, but it somehow works when it gets to Oakland County, making Oakland County one of the highest rated suburbs in the United States, right? Based on Morningstar ratings. So I think it's important to remember that politics are really sort of making this possible. And in the chat, some people want to know, what is a loan originator? And is this still going on?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you go ahead. Either way, he was the one who wrote the loan. When you got a loan from a mortgage, someone writes the loan, and then they would sell it to another bank, and then they would sell it to a securitized fund. Gilbert originally was a loan originator. Now he's grown into a holder of loans. But ultimately, you're right. The federal government's role was paramount in all this, because the federal government is what guaranteed all the loans. It bailed out the banks, guaranteed the loans. And when the evictions came, almost all the evictions as a result of foreclosures were carried out by the federal government. The government carried out the evictions because they bought out the loans. They bailed out the banks for the loans, took them off the hands of the banks, and almost all the evictions due to foreclosures from 2005 to really more from 2008 to around 2013 or 14 were carried out by the federal government. And that federal government was not just the Republicans. That was
also the Democrats. Let me cut in here, because Scott makes a really good point in his book where he says somehow it's passé, right? We're going to bail out the banks. We're going to bail out auto. But when it comes to bail out Detroit, we're just not cool anymore. But that sort of seems, to lack a little bit. Can you help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah, I want to use that loan originator metaphor. People know what used car salesmen are, right? They collect a commission when you buy a car, and they will bend the truth or, cover up some flaws to get you to buy it. And then 6 months later, you're stuck with this lemon, right? It's the same thing metaphorically with people selling you a mortgage. They collect their fees for that. Then they pass it off to, someone on Wall Street, right? And you might get stuck with a bad mortgage or a bad house at the end of it, but they've collected their fees, just like the people demolishing houses now. They collect their fee up front and then they move on. It shows you why it's really a systemic crisis, why Detroit's crisis can't be separated from the systemic crisis. In the prior model of capitalism and up through the 60s and 70s, you had companies getting very wealthy, of course, and CEOs becoming millionaires, but they were selling actual products. They were selling cars. And that meant somebody had to buy them. Somebody had to build them and somebody had to buy them. So in order to have stable production, they gave workers more benefits, higher wages, unionized security over the years. And then in order for middle-class people to buy these products, Henry Ford started with the $5 a day. Eventually people had, the so-called American dream of a middle-class standard of living, right? That is really one model based upon, again, capitalists making millions, but not necessarily billions, and workers, having a middle-class standard. That's really what has been undermined over the past 50 years. Wages for working-class people have basically stagnated, while profits for corporations, and salaries for CEOs have skyrocketed. Everyone knows this basic, read someone like Robert Reich, who's kind of written textbooks on this. And think about this now. When people can't afford to buy these things because they're being paid decently, how do you keep collecting fees from them? You have to basically sell them debt. Right. And so much of what's happening now is people not even buying products, but people, companies profiting off of their debt. And Wall Street, the financial sector, Wall Street is just a metaphor for the financial sector, they don't make money by selling products or building products. They make money by basically collecting these financial fees. And so there's just no incentive to build a decent product, to treat workers decently so they help you build those products, or to pay workers decently so that they can afford your product. We've really moved to very so much of the labor now can be done, you know, at much cheaper wages through outsourcing and so on. And the other shift towards the suburbs was not just in Detroit, but towards cities like Phoenix or other places, you know, in the Sun Belt region that never had strong unions, right? So that's a big point. And I think that the parallel that any student can see today is what's happened with education. I mean, college used to basically be free. You know, you could work a part-time job and easily pay for going to Wayne State or the University of Michigan. Even when I started college, it was only something like, you know, $700 a quarter at UCLA, which is one of the top universities in the world. Now, people can't even get a college education for the most part, unless your parents are already, you know, wealthy and they give you a trust fund, without taking out tens of thousands of dollars. So college is simply, people don't even expect to pay houses off anymore, right? So many elderly people are actually now retiring with student loans. So everything is now based upon not actually owning anything, but simply being in debt. And if you're lucky, being able to make payments. And that in many ways is what's happened in Detroit, as Jerry talked about. You used to have people who made good union wages and people who had public employment that gave them decent wages and oftentimes unionized contracts with that. That's so much what was eroded over time and then rapidly abolished through the bankruptcy, state takeover, emergency management regime.
And just if I can just add one thing to that, is that along those same lines is the banks played the same role to the cities and to governments. Is what happens when the tax base, when people are making less funds or when people are getting thrown out of work, the tax base for the city government goes down. So what happens? The banks then, we'll give you a loan. And they put the cities in debt, just like they do to the individuals, and their debts are no less onerous. So when the city can't pay its debt or pay really the exotic forms of debt, what happens? They said, well, you got to privatize the water. You got, and water is being privatized all over the world. There's a study that 70% of the world's water has been privatized since 2004, and the motivator was the World Bank. You know, you've got to privatize well, in Detroit, you had to privatize the whole city, but that's been the phenomenon, and that's going on in Puerto Rico. You have to privatize the electrical industry. You have to privatize every segment of the population to pay off debt. It's what they call austerity. And it's a worldwide phenomenon, and it's a product of the dominance of finance capital at every level. And you know, and if a city government's not doing it fast enough, or if a country's not doing it, they impose direct control. Yeah. That's really what emergency management, they did the same thing to Greece. They do the same thing to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's run by the Financial Control Board. It's another form of an emergency manager.
I want to go back to something you had said earlier, Jerry, about how you left Ann Arbor because you knew that the revolution would not happen with students. And apropos this conversation about student debt and student loans, I mean, if anything, we saw the power of students, right, young youth, to mobilize, in fact, the planet. Black Lives Matter protests that started, you know, over the summer, and that quickly were picked up in other countries. I mean, a lot of our students, for instance, were down in Detroit protesting, and that protest was pretty consistent. It's still going on. You know, it hasn't stopped. It wasn't something that ended when the media coverage packed up. So I want to get back to, I guess, the power of people. You know, it surprises me, Scott, that you have such a short conclusion to your book. But what's brilliant about your book is the chapter before. I mean, the book is great for many reasons, but I love the chapter before the conclusion where you talk about Detroit activists. And you point out specifically African-American women activists. You say, for instance, that we're trying to engage the post-industrial proletariat. I wonder if you could talk about, I mean, why Black women? And you know, what is this sort of new revolution about?
I think one of the things we're pointing out by talking about a system in crisis is, on the one hand, again, you do have the rich getting richer over this past 50 years, and you have people at the suburbs benefiting at the expense of Detroit, but not in any way that's sustainable, right? As we said, again, it's one thing if you're selling products to the workers who build them. It's another thing if you're simply profiting off people going deeper and deeper in debt, then you have to be bailed out, eventually in order to keep that going. And so really what I'm looking for are, who are the people that recognize that this is unsustainable, that's not just unequitable, but it's unsustainable, and how do we create a different model? How do we try to break from the values and practices of that existing system and move to a different way of living, surviving, rooted in solidarity, rooted in people at the grassroots expressing their own sense of power and hope and creativity. So one model of that Detroit's really become known for is the urban farming movement, right? Where on the one hand, it's a survival mechanism for people that, as people know, Detroit has these so-called food deserts all over the places where instead of healthy, grocery stores, people have to buy fast food or convenience store, party store food at a gas station. So people grow their own food, but the farming movement also becomes a way for communities to come together, for people to say all these vacant lots, right? They shouldn't just be taken over by speculators and developers. They should be owned in common by the people in the communities for their own benefit. That the fact that there's been all this abandonment actually creates an opportunity for people to reclaim that space so that everything is not owned by some private company or some absentee landlord, right? And then it becomes a way for the elders, so many Detroit elders are Black elders from the South, to connect with youth who don't know from personal firsthand experience how food grows. And so, literally young people are learning, what does it mean to create a sustainable way of living that our ancestors did to survive for, tens and hundreds and thousands of generations before us, right? And so I think that's one example where I think the cultural values and the political values and the values of social justice and racial equity, can all come together. There's other ways, obviously, where it's happening through the movements against police brutality, not just trying to, demonstrate against the police, but also create model forms of abolition, right? And defunding the police, where neighborhoods on their own take care of each other and don't need to call the police, because it's one of my mentors, Ron Scott, who's joined the Ancestors, who was really who was a founder of the Black Panther Party in Detroit, went on to become really prominent community activist, particularly in the fight against police brutality, as he said. So many of the times when the police are called, and this was the case with I'm thinking I'm just blanking right now. The case in Wisconsin, right? Someone was called to, the police were called on sort of a domestic argument, and then the police end up actually causing, more violence and death and destruction than preventing it in so many cases. So how do we create models where communities are self-empowered, where they're self-sustaining, where they don't have to call? Those are the kind of models that are particularly coming out of Black women-led formations. So much of the fight for water security continues to be led by Black women. The fight really against emergency management in general has really had Black women at the center. And so, those are just examples of ways in which, again, people don't have to see their situation, although you're up against the odds, against people with power and money. It's not a hopeless situation, right? There's always power in people organizing. And organizing doesn't just mean protesting. It doesn't just mean voting. It doesn't just mean changing the people in power. It's changing the way we relate to each other, changing the way we relate to our land, our food, our work, so that it's not that, so that we're disempowering the privatization forces that want to own and control everything and act like we have no power.
I really appreciate that. It's definitely true that I see in Detroit, especially amongst activists, a call for, an end to this mindless consumption, the need to always measure your worth based on what you have instead of what you do.
And that's that's a trend that connects Detroit with what's happening all around the world. I mean, this is what the Zapatista movement has, really meant in Mexico. There's so many movements in Latin America that have been pushing in this direction, in Asia, in Africa. It's really about, at its heart, they may be different philosophies here and there, or different tactics here and there, but it's about recognizing that how did human beings survive as communities, as people in solidarity with each other for so many years, in harmony with the earth and with other living things. Obviously this is really essential to indigenous peoples' cultures and modes of governance. And we, in a very, very short period, and people know this by looking what's happening with climate change, in a very short period of time, disrupted those patterns that had sustained life, not just human life, all forms of life on earth, plant life, animal life, for centuries. And it's so clear that in a very abrupt period of time, we disrupted that and we're out of balance.
I think it's funny because that real plunder of the earth starts about, the real escalation of the plunder starts about 50 years ago, right after World War II. So
it's also important. Do you have a minute? So we getting
No, go ahead.
Just one thing I want to add just along those lines is, the last period, the demonstrations have been phenomenal that we've seen among the youth. And one of the things that's been so great about it is, in all my years of activism, I've never seen I came in where the war was the motivator, and people were faced with having to demonstrate. They were faced with going to war, and it was a real motivator for why you hate, and it produced a lot of young activists on a multinational level. But what's phenomenal in these demonstrations is to see so many multinational youth and white youth marching behind Black leadership around a fight that's led around Black Lives Matter. Think about it, and certainly it's been motivated. The motivating factor in the march is the outrages, the racist outrages that we saw with George Floyd and so many others. But why is it that but think of, we've had marches for Black Lives Matter in Howell, Michigan. That's traditionally the center of the Klan. There were thousands of people. I went up to a demonstration in Royal Oak. Thousands of people, almost all white, marching for Black Lives. Man, why is this happening now? I think in part it's because white youth are also seeing no future in the system. Like Scott said, you come out of school now, you have thousands of dollars in debt. You can't find a decent enough job to just pay off your debt. Wages in general have been lowered for all sectors of the economy. Adjunct professors can't make a living anymore, right? They're organizing. And I think it's creating the basis for unity, for class unity. In what the ruling class relied on for many years was being able to pay whites enough money to basically buy off their passivity in the face of capitalism. And they did. It was a worldwide phenomenon. Lenin used to call it the aristocracy of labor, but that's gone. The capitalists are so greedy now that they don't pay anyone a decent wage. And it's in the era of technology, they don't feel they gotta pay anyone a decent wage. So what we're seeing is this lowering of standards, and it creates the basis for unity. And it's led by those who are the most oppressed by the system just because of their race or nationality. But it's a wonderful phenomenon to see. It's bringing in many, many more people. And it's going to assert itself, because while the working class may not be industrial, what are they building now? Now they're building warehouses for, like Amazon builds these warehouses. Well, to me, it's almost like the industrial workers of the 30s. This is a new proletariat. And I believe the power is going to exist to really challenge the system. And I think this new phenomenon, and they're not interested, be honest with you, these youth aren't interested in getting sucked into voting for the lesser of two evils. They want to challenge the system. And I think it's healthy phenomenon. And for someone like me, who's been a revolutionary all my life, I've never been more optimistic. And also, it's also connected to the fact that the very existence of the planet is dependent on taking on this struggle, because capitalism will destroy the planet, and it's destroying it. And it's like Chavez called on that the war, the fight of this century is the fight to fight for socialism is to save the sister planet. And I think all these phenomena are leading to what I think is a rebirth of revolutionary struggle, and it leads me to much optimism. And it's obviously combined with what Scott said, people creating their own institutions, but also challenging the system so we can create the whole society as a new institution based on human need and not profit.
It may not be revolutionary, but I want to remind everybody that we're less than 3 weeks away from the 2020 election. And with the 2020 election, you have redistricting, right? Not only do you have redistricting, you also have legislative seats being assigned. Right. So we are talking about a moment where at least Biden has been pushed very much to the left on his environmental policy, precisely because Trump was, so militant about rolling back a lot of the regulations on environmental exploitation. So on that note, I really appreciate the work that both of you have done in support of Detroit. And I also want to, recognize my students who are on this call, the youth who are, right, going to save the planet for us all. Yeah. I thank you all, everybody on this call for your work. I'm going to ask the students to go ahead and leave. I'm going to stop the recording, and I would love for Scott and Jerry to stay on for a minute.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you all.